Hello and welcome on France 24 and Radio France International. Our guest today is the former French President François Hollande, and together with me, Christophe Boisbouvier of RFI. Mr. President, hello. 10 years ago, exactly, François Hollande, you took the decision to engage France militarily in Mali to push back the jihadi groups. A few months ago, the French soldiers withdrew at the request of the Malian authorities, and the jihadis gained ground. You often say you do not regret your decision of January 2013, but frankly, 10 years later, isn't it a failure?
No. Well, first of all, the decision that I took on behalf of France in January 2013, I didn't take it because France had any interest in Mali. I took that decision at the request of the interim president of Mali at the time and all the African heads of states who were asking us, indeed imploring us to act, to contain, to repel a jihadist attack that was without doubt going to Bamako. Now, if France, and I was still president at that time, remained in Mali, it was still at the request of the authorities and also the full international community. Let me remind you that the UN had also decided to be present through a peacekeeping mission in Mali. Now, if we'd wanted to combat jihadism, it's not because it threatened us, but it was striking Malian civilian populations, and that we know wider afield in Burkina, Niger, in the Sahel and elsewhere. So it was a duty of solidarity for us.
Yeah, but the jihadis gained ground.
Yes, and of course, after we left, I was no longer president that time. When the French forces and other contingents pulled out, the jihadists took that opportunity to act, and we inflicted very significant losses on them, including on their leadership. But once the French forces pulled out, the jihadists who'd maintained positions extended those and deployed into other areas. And that's why France can only be present if it is asked to be present. It's always been my belief there's no undermining of sovereignty of a country when it calls upon France. Let me recall what I said when I went to Bamako when Timbuktu was liberated and northern Mali could return to a relative form of quiet. I said that it was a duty of solidarity because I didn't forget what the Africans did during the two world wars in coming to help France, and a recent film recalls that mobilization. So it was a way of paying our debt to Mali as well as to the African countries that the French forces came to Mali. And if there were losses, of course, there were also people who suffered significantly, but there were
59
French fatalities, 59 soldiers who sacrificed their lives because I decided to intervene in Mali. And well, those soldiers didn't die in vain, but they were in a mission fighting against groups that were oppressing the population, and they weren't there to seek any economic interest, mining interest, to make a grab for the resources of Mali, Burkina Faso, or Niger. There was nothing in exchange given, no commercial advantages, requests for concessions for particular infrastructure, nothing. There was no quid pro quo. We didn't need a quid pro quo. We were united friends.
In your memoirs published in 2018, you say that the military headquarters warned you that a jihad column could reach the capital city, Bamako, within 3 or 4 days, even less. Some say that this kind of threat didn't exist. You exaggerated to sell, quote-unquote, the Serval mission to the public. Did you have obvious evidence by air or human that the jihadis will take Bamako?
Yes, we had information, very clear, very precise, indicating the assembly of vehicles driven by jihadists who were moving towards Bamako. Maybe they could have stopped on the way, we don't know, but they were heading for Bamako. It's not just France on the basis of its own information that said that. I still recall, since you're recalling that, the interim president of Mali, who on the telephone said to me, well, come because tomorrow or the day after it'll be too late. I had the telephone call from the president of the African Union who was saying, well, we have information indicating that the jihadists are equipped with vehicles that were taken from the Chadian and the Libyan conflict previously, that they're coming and they have equipment to control a town. Later, I asked myself the question, was it possible for a few hundred jihadis to control a town like Bamako? And when I also had to face events in Iraq, that Mosul fell under the pressure of a few dozen, 100,000 jihadists against an organized army, as the Iraqi army was, I said, yes, it's possible for these jihadis to reach Bamako, but also to control the Malian capital. For how long, we don't know, but they could have targeted that and achieved it. That's why I didn't exaggerate anything, and it's rather the Malians, through their authorities, asked me to act because they were under threat.
Right after the reconquest of the north by Serval, you go beginning of February to Timbuktu and then to Bamako, and you say there, it's a quote that remained famous, I just experienced the most important day in my political life. Haven't you been slightly carried away by the military victory? Or 10 years later, given the situation of Mali and of Sahel, generally speaking, don't you regret having said that?
No, I don't, because I truly felt those words, not because we'd won a military victory, because the people were there. Women were wrapping themselves in the French flag. Large crowds in Timbuktu and Bamako were asking us to stay and expressing their gratitude. You see these images that I still have in mind that are being shown. You see that people were grateful for what France was doing. And then I was saddened to see these ties fraying based on friendship, the gratefulness of the population in Mali, but also in France. Many Malians have a livelihood in our country and live their lives peacefully. So I was sad to see the situation deteriorate. Why did it deteriorate? Because precisely as was said, jihadism continued to strike, and the Malians are saying, well, it's never going to end for us. And in spite of the intervention of France or the UN mission, the African forces supporting them, there are still atrocities, still suffering, barbaric acts being committed, and also probably because a military operation that lasts 10 years gives the impression that we're seeking something else other than just helping. There's a form of occupation of the country, something we've always rejected. And then propaganda that took root on the social networks, indicating that France was coming to dominate a country, seeking to humiliate it, dominate it, control it, and that wasn't at all the case. Just look at the influence that Wagner has, or the networks fueled by the Russians that managed to convince part of the population that they would protect them better than we could. And I think the neo-colonials are them.
Well, the French military withdrew from Mali and the Russians came in. Could the Russians succeed where the French failed on the military ground, or you're concerned 10 years earlier the jihadists wouldn't seize Bamako? Is it still actual?
Well, first of all, when we came with our own flag, at the request of the Malian authorities, with the support of all the countries of the region and also of the legitimacy conferred on us by the United Nations. Indeed, the legality of the UN. It's not a country today. Russia doesn't declare that it's present through its own armed forces or troops. It's a private group. And we know its ties with the Kremlin, a private group that lives from the money it receives or the predatory activities that it conducts on a territory. It's a private group that isn't answerable before any international institution, a private group. We don't know where its funding comes from, and the soldiers that make it up, very often former criminals who are there for interests that are similar to what we used to call mercenary activities.
Yes, but if they succeed?
Well, the other question is the one that you ask. Are they succeeding? Are there fewer terror attacks, less occupation, less action by the jihadists? The answer is no. No, it's worse. The situation is worse. Jihadism is spreading, striking civilian populations with massacres noted by a number of observers. They're also striking in southern Mali, where they weren't present, not to mention central Mali, where there's renewed fighting, very often striking the civilian population with ethnic clashes that have been rekindled. That's why I think this group has absolutely no legality in its operation, has no general interest in being there, save very specific interests, and isn't effective when it comes to fighting terrorism. Now, I respect the sovereignty of countries. As I said, France only came because it was called upon. It left because its president was no longer desired. If Malians wish to have relations with a private group, it's a matter for them. With a state other than France, it's their business, but they will have to answer to that in due course.
Quickly, another operation you launched, Sangaré, Central Africa in 2013. 3 years later, France withdraws its troops against the will of Archange Touadéra, the president who was under the threat of rebel groups. Hence, he calls in the Russians of Wagner. Very simple question now. Have you been totally taken by surprise? Weren't you prepared for the Russians to settle in Bangui?
Well, that's exactly the opposite criticism. You might say, why didn't you stay longer? Well, precisely because we were committed in Mali, ready to intervene in a wider area in Sahel. We also had our commitments in the Middle East, even if it's not the same troops that conduct those operations. There was a limit, physical almost. I'm not talking about a political limit, but we wanted that the UN MINUSCA peace mission should take over and support the elected president of Central Africa to bring about reconciliation and stability in the country. And there again, others were called upon.
You didn't see it coming. That was my question.
Well, we probably saw it coming without understanding that there again it was more than military support, but grab on the country's resources. We see the diamond mines interest a number of private groups, and there are flows at work. And there again, it's the decision of the Central African authorities. It's up to them to know what they want as their destiny. And I find it's rather unfortunate that a group such as Wagner has established itself as it has. Would France have dissuaded it in its presence? I'm not sure.
And then Chad, following the death on the battlefield of Idriss Deby, almost 2 years ago, Emmanuel Macron went to N'Djamena to support the transition led by the son of Idriss Déby, Mohamed Déby. But now, demonstrations against his will to stay in power were repressed in blood. 50 deaths on October 20. France reacted only mildly, but Paris condemned very firmly the coup that happened in Mali, Burkina, Guinea-Conakry. Isn't there too much leniency on behalf of France regarding the Chadian regime?
Well, there again, as French president, I was led to forging strong ties with the President Déby because President Déby was very forthcoming, active at a time when the jihadis had to be expelled from northern Mali. So there I know what we owe to Chad and the sacrifice of his soldiers. And Chad has always agreed to take part in our international operations. I recall what we did against a terrorist group that was very active around Lake Chad and is still very much present. Now, when President Déby died, I was no longer in office at that time. It wasn't really a coup that took place, rather a military succession with the idea that this transition would only last a short while and the son of President Déby would not run for election. And today it's precisely the opposite that's happening. Not only did he renege on commitments made, but a very severe repression and prisoners. I have the same attitude every time there's a coup, freedom's challenged, and I condemn that decision.
You think your successor wasn't firm enough?
I think he knows that we have a base in Chad, that Chad is cooperating in the fight against jihadism, but it's no reason for us to be tolerant in respect of serious threats to freedoms, human rights, and opponents to this regime.
Thank you, Mr. President, for having granted us this interview, and thank you for following us on both channels, France 24 and Radio France International.
200 years ago, a unique country was born, Liberia. It was founded to welcome emancipated American slaves, a dream that rapidly turned into a nightmare.
When they came to this place, they used a gun to subdue the native to really surrender the land.
Followed a battle for domination, civil war, corruption, and massacres.
It is the result of not only the war, but the result of social inequities that created conditions for war.
What is the situation today? Our teams went to find out. Watch Liberia Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.